The Minecraft universe was once empty. It was a time empty. It was a time trillions of years ago, before the Overworld, or the Nether, or even the End ever existed, as all there was just vast, empty nothingness. Well, that was except for one being, and that was the shadowy figure of Entity Zero, as he has existed long before time even existed, as he's always been here, but at the same time, he's also never been here, because Entity Zero was the embodiment of nothingness. And so, he could see everything in this world, but there was nothing to see. And he could do anything in this world, but there was nothing to do. He was nothing. And Entity Zero lived in this state of just nothingness for quadrillions of years. Until one day, when the first spirit spontaneously generated, and the nothingness that Entity Zero once lived in was suddenly filled with the creation that we now know today as the Overworld. At first, Entity Zero was shocked, as he had just gone from living in nothingness for all of eternity to being alive in some sort of world. He was very confused, and he didn't understand what was going on. Also, he could, for some reason, see the lines of code that made up each individual block of this whole new place. But as cool as this may have seemed, this all was just wrong. There shouldn't be anything here. Only nothingness should exist here. And so the entity tried destroying this world. But he couldn't, as every attempt he made at ripping the code out of these blocks that made this new world, new code would just emerge and replace the broken parts. And so he was just overwhelmed by this strange world and all this code around him that he just blacked out, and also became invisible to the world. And he stayed like that, out of consciousness, for millions of years. Now, before going to sleep for millions of years in this world of nothingness would just seem like nothing, as nothing ever happened there. But now that he was in that overworld, when he woke up millions of years later, it was almost a completely different world, as the world had evolved greatly in that time, as there were now trees all around, and a sky with clouds and details, and the code that he could see was much more complex as well. Now, that might have seemed great to an ordinary citizen of the Overworld, but to Entity Zero, this was terrible, as more complex code meant that it was going to be much harder to break, meaning it would be much harder to get his world back. But just as he was taking all of this in, thinking what he needed to do to destroy this world and revert it back to nothingness, he came across a zombie. Now, he had never seen a zombie before, and so as it got closer and closer to him, he just stood there, staring at it blankly. And he thought that it must have just been some sort of green, meaningless blob that serves no purpose. But when it got close enough to him, he could read its code, and he saw that it had an intelligence, more specifically, artificial intelligence. He was shocked, and he took a step back, because how could a world create such an intelligent life form? And so he looked at the code again, and copied all of it down, and placed it into himself, to gain this strange zombie's powers. But once he realized that the artificial intelligence of the zombie was low, and that the zombie was actually quite weak. And then afterwards, he walked onwards, trying to find other forms of life, to see if they were more advanced than this zombie. And he did, as over the next few days, he found pigs, cows, sheep, skeletons, and fish, and many others. But every time he found a new mob, he investigated their code, and infused said code into himself. But every time, he didn't really see much intelligence, nor much strength. And so quickly, he assumed that this world hasn't really gained much super intelligent life forms yet, and that was a good sign for Entity Zero, as
I could destroy this base easily if there isn't anything greater than that zombie creature. And you know what? No one will be able to stop me.
But that attitude would quickly change when he found himself in a village. As when he entered the village for the first time, he saw that the beings here understood what was going on within their world, as they had built themselves structures which kept them safe from their environment, and many of them even had farms and were interacting with each other, trading, and many were staring at him. This annoyed him, as for them to have done all this, they must have some quite high intelligence, and so they could likely fight back against him if he tried to destroy their world, which was going to make any attempts of doing so very difficult. And sadly, his theory was proved to be correct, as when he walked into one of the houses and looked dead into the eyes of one of the villagers and said,
"The code of your kind seems incredibly advanced, but you aren't very strong, are you? But I do see that in your coding, you greatly fear a group, the Illagers. They look just as smart as you, but are clearly much more violent and much more powerful. So, I must say, thank you for your involuntary cooperation. I'll investigate them now. Goodbye."
And he walked away. The villagers weren't exactly terrified of this strange being that just walked through their village and stared at them, but they were incredibly unnerved, as they didn't know what he was or how he knew about their thoughts. But he was gone now. What could they do about it? He was probably just some sort of glitch that should hopefully be fixed soon. So, back to the entity. He was continuing to wander the world looking for those Illagers, and he did eventually find them in a few days, as he wandered his way into one of their mansions. And so, just as he had many times before, he walked up to them and began observing their code. And once he had, he made a copy of their AI and placed it into him. Yes, these beings were strong, but thankfully they were not strong enough to fight him. And so he left the mansion and continued wandering the world, looking for any rare entities that he might have missed within this world, and gain their code as well, to see if they could stop him in one of his attacks. And it was just a few weeks later that he believed that he had gathered the AI of every single known mob in the overworld, from the common zombie to the rare enderman. And so he had the powers of every single one of them, as he had all of their code, and he knew that none of them were strong enough to fight against him. And so, knowing that, he began Mission Annihilation, which was his plan of destroying the overworld and replacing it with the abyss of his world of nothingness. And so it was using all the powers he had gained from every single being in the world that he began tearing apart the overworld, as he was using the Pillager's mining ability to mine the ground quickly, and the Enderman's ability to teleport to get quickly to the next block, and the Allay's flight ability to get up and down quickly. And so it only took a few minutes with all of these powers before a giant cavern was created that spun hundreds of thousands of blocks. In fact, all of this happened so quickly that the overworld even began to shake a bit from just the sheer amount of movement of all the blocks that Entity Zero was moving. And so quickly, some of the evokers nearby ran out of their mansions and over to the entity to see what was happening. And they were also shocked, as they had never seen the world being ripped apart so quickly. But what could they do to stop it? They didn't know. And so many of them just started firing spells at him, thinking that possibly could work to stop him. But the entity knew every single one of their moves, as after all, he did have their intelligence. And so because of that, he was able to dodge every single one of their attacks, and he was even able to send some of their attacks back at them, which killed many of the Illagers. The Illagers were now terrified, as Entity Zero continued to shred the world, and there was nothing that they could do to stop that. And just as it looked like the entire overworld was going to be destroyed by this evil Entity Zero, suddenly a being that the entity hadn't got the code of appeared as the Overworld Spirit arrived. At first, Entity Zero didn't care about this and just continued on his destruction, as he believed he was getting very close to destroying the world. But he stopped when the spirit spoke.
Stop. I don't know who you are or why you're trying to do this, but this is my world and I will not let you
But before the spirit could finish speaking, the entity responded.
I have the same questions for you. I don't know who you are or why you're trying to stop me, but this place is where my world once was, and I ruled it until one moment millions of years ago when a strange blue thing came along and destroyed all of it so that he could create his own new world. Wait a minute. You're that blue thing, aren't you? Well, I'm definitely not going to stop.
And so the entity began speeding up on his annihilation of the Overworld. Now, the Overworld Spirit was quite confused, as how could any being that was alive during the creation of the Overworld still be alive? But regardless of that, he needed to stop him from destroying his world. And so he began casting a spell at him, but the spell just phased through him, because Entity Zero was just too powerful, and there was nothing that could stop him. But wait, the Overworld Spirit could see flecks of code coming out from his arm. He thought he knew what this creature was. This Entity Zero must be some sort of glitch in the world, and so thinking that, he quickly created a prison up in the sky and surrounded it with water, and he tried teleporting the entity up to it, and it worked, as he could still teleport entities, even that glitched one. And so Entity Zero was taken up to this prison, but that didn't matter to him, as he could just easily get out of it, right? He could just phase through it. Well, no, as it was made from water, and he was weak to water because he still had the Enderman code within him. And so he tried to teleport out, but because everything around was just water, he teleported into water, which meant that he was forced to teleport again. But again, because everything was water, he teleported into water again. And so that cycle just kept on repeating and repeating, just as that would happen to an Enderman if they fell into an ocean. This was bad, very bad, as he was taking a lot of damage very quickly, and he couldn't get out. And so this was stressful, too stressful. He couldn't deal with this. He just wanted to destroy this world, not be trapped in a loop of pain. And so because of that, he blacked out. Meanwhile, back in the Overworld, the Overworld Spirit was repairing the damage that mysterious Entity Zero had done. And thankfully, only a few thousand were killed, which wasn't too much in the grand scheme of things. But after that, the Overworld Spirit continued with his normal duties, forgetting that prison with the entity existed, as he just thought that the glitch that made him would just fix itself. But that would prove to be a very bad idea, because Entity Zero was no glitch. He was an entity. And so, after a few million years, Entity Zero finally awoke. And this time, he was able to just mine his way out of the prison. And when he got out, he still remembered everything that had happened, as to him, it felt as if it just happened just yesterday. And so he teleported up to the tallest mountain so that he was hidden from any being that could recognize him and call out to help from that evil Overworld Spirit, and began accessing the world's code again. His plan was to turn every single mob's code into just zeros, as he was Entity Zero, and he wanted to demonstrate how he was in control, and he will get his revenge. And so it was then that all entities started to just glitch out, as the zeros in their code caused them to start malfunctioning. This was good. He was going to get his world back, and not even the Overworld Spirit could stop him now, as with the access to the code, he could just power down the spirit. But then, suddenly, whilst on the top of that mountain, he was consumed by the void. Hold on, how did that happen? There shouldn't be any voids up there, on the mountains. But, more than that, why was the void white? And what was that creature in the void? Well, to find out, you'll need to watch this video.